Most people who walked past the massive biker sitting alone in the courthouse hallway that Tuesday morning gave him a wide berth, their eyes darting nervously toward the skull patches stitched across his leather vest before they hurried toward the safety of the elevators. But the elderly woman clutching a worn manila folder didn't hesitate when she shuffled slowly toward him, her thin frame trembling slightly as she lowered herself onto the wooden bench beside him without asking permission. For a moment, she simply sat there catching her breath while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the sound of dress shoes clicking against marble echoed through the empty corridor. Then she turned toward the intimidating stranger beside her and whispered 6 desperate words that would turn a quiet morning into something nobody in Jefferson County would ever forget. "Don't let them take my home." What happened next would expose a scheme that had been quietly destroying lives for years, and it would prove that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom wearing a suit. Sometimes it rolls up on 2 wheels wearing leather and carrying a loyalty that runs deeper than law. But that moment was still hours away. The morning had started differently for Marcus Stone Briggs, a full-patch member of the Hells Angels who had ridden into town the night before for a court appearance of his own. A minor traffic violation that barely warranted the trip, but the club took legal matters seriously, even small ones. He had arrived early, parked his Harley in the nearly empty lot behind the courthouse, and settled onto the bench outside courtroom 3 to wait for his name to be called. He was a mountain of a man, easily 6'4" with shoulders that strained against his vest and a thick gray beard that covered half his weathered face. His hands, scarred from decades of engine work and bar fights he rarely started but always finished, rested calmly on his knees as he watched lawyers and clerks drift past like schools of fish avoiding a shark. Stone didn't mind. He preferred the space. The old woman appeared from around the corner, moving slowly with the careful steps of someone whose body had started betraying them years ago. She wore a faded blue dress that looked like it had been carefully pressed that morning, and her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun. But it was her eyes that caught Stone's attention when she finally sat down beside him, wide, exhausted, and carrying the kind of fear that came from fighting a battle already lost. She opened the folder in her lap with shaking fingers, revealing a stack of legal documents covered in dense type and official stamps. Stone glanced over briefly, not meaning to intrude, but the heading at the top of the first page was impossible to miss. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. The woman stared at the papers for a long moment before turning toward him. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly, her voice cracking slightly. "I know you don't know me, but I've been sitting in that courtroom for 3 days and nobody will listen." Stone shifted slightly, his leather creaking. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you think I can do." She wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears gathering there. "I just need someone to hear me before it's too late." Stone exhaled slowly, glancing toward the courtroom doors. His hearing wasn't scheduled for another hour. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm listening." The woman's name was Dorothy Keane, and she had lived in the same house on Willow Creek Road for 47 years. The house where she and her husband had raised 2 daughters, where she had buried him after cancer took him 6 years earlier, and where she had planned to spend whatever time she had left surrounded by memories and the garden he had planted for her. But 3 months ago, a letter had arrived from a company called Sunrise Holdings claiming she had defaulted on a loan she didn't remember taking. The paperwork looked official. Her signature appeared at the bottom of documents she swore she had never seen before. And despite her protests, despite showing bank statements proving she had never received the loan money, the foreclosure process had moved forward with terrifying speed. "They say I owe $60,000, Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I never borrowed anything. My house has been paid off since 1998. Stone's jaw tightened. "You got a lawyer?" She nodded weakly. "A public defender. He's trying, but he keeps saying the signatures match and the paperwork is filed correctly." She looked down at the folder. "They're taking the house today. The judge signed the order this morning." For a moment, the hallway went quiet except for the distant hum of voices inside the courtroom. Stone stared at the documents in her lap, his mind already turning over the pieces of what she had just described. Fraudulent loans, forged signatures, victims too old or too scared to fight back effectively. He had seen schemes like this before, usually targeting veterans or widows, people who didn't understand legal jargon and couldn't afford lawyers who did. This company, Stone said slowly. Sunrise Holdings. You know who runs it? Dorothy shook her head. Just a name on the letterhead. Richard Voss. Stone's expression darkened. He knew that name. And suddenly, this wasn't just an old woman's problem anymore. Richard Voss was the kind of man who wore expensive suits to hide cheap morals, and Stone Briggs had crossed paths with him exactly once, 3 years earlier, when Voss had tried to buy the property where the Hells Angels clubhouse sat on the edge of town. The offer had been generous at first, then aggressive, then threatening, until the club made it clear the conversation was over. Voss had left angry, muttering about zoning laws and legal pressure, but nothing had come of it. Until now. Stone leaned back against the bench, his mind working through the implications. If Voss was behind Sunrise Holdings, then Dorothy Keane wasn't the only victim. Men like Voss didn't run small cons. They built systems. Mrs. Keane, Stone said carefully. How many other people you know dealing with this same company? Dorothy hesitated, then admitted there were others. At least 4 families on her street alone had received similar letters. One couple had already lost their home 2 months earlier. Another man, a widower named Carl, had stopped answering his door entirely after the foreclosure notice arrived. Stone pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to the club's vice president. Need you at County Courthouse. Now. Bring Reaper and Diesel. Dorothy watched him nervously. I don't want to cause trouble. Stone met her eyes. Ma'am, trouble's already here. You just didn't start it. Within 20 minutes, 3 more motorcycles rumbled into the courthouse parking lot. The riders moved through the building with quiet purpose, their boots echoing through the marble halls as they joined Stone on the bench. Dorothy sat among them looking small and fragile, surrounded by men whose combined presence made passing lawyers visibly uncomfortable. Stone explained the situation in low tones while the others listened with expressions that grew steadily darker. Reaper, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, muttered that he knew a paralegal who owed him a favor. Diesel, broad as a truck and twice as stubborn, suggested they pay Sunrise Holdings a visit and ask some direct questions. But it was Stone who made the call that changed everything. He dialed the number he hadn't used in years, and when the voice on the other end answered, he said simply, "It's Stone. I need a lawyer who fights dirty." The name he was given belonged to Catherine Cross, a defense attorney known for taking cases nobody else wanted and winning them through sheer relentless preparation. She arrived at the courthouse 90 minutes later wearing a sharp blazer and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. Stone met her outside the courtroom and explained everything in under 5 minutes. Catherine listened without interrupting, her eyes scanning the foreclosure documents Dorothy handed over. When she finished reading, she looked up with an expression that was equal parts fury and focus. "This is fraud," she said flatly. "Systematic, organized fraud." She turned toward the courtroom doors. "Is the hearing still active?" Stone nodded. "Judge was supposed to finalize the order an hour ago." Catherine straightened her blazer. "Then let's interrupt him." What happened next unfolded with the precision of a perfectly timed ambush. Catherine pushed through the courtroom doors with Stone and Dorothy following close behind, just as the judge was preparing to sign the final foreclosure paperwork. The lawyer representing Sunrise Holdings, a slick young man named Brennan, looked up in confusion as the group approached the bench. "Your Honor," Catherine said firmly, "I'm entering appearance on behalf of Mrs. Dorothy Keane, and I'm filing an emergency motion to halt these proceedings pending a fraud investigation." Judge Callahan, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, frowned. "Counselor, this case has already been heard. With all due respect, Your Honor, it was heard without critical evidence." Catherine placed a folder on the bench. "These documents show that Mrs. Keane's signature was forged, that no loan funds were ever transferred to her account, and that Sunrise Holdings has filed at least 17 similar foreclosures in this county alone over the past 2 years." Brennan stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is a baseless delay tactic, is it?" Catherine cut him off, pulling out a highlighted bank statement. "Because Mrs. Keane's financial records show 0 deposits matching the alleged loan amount, which means either your client is mistaken or they're running a predatory scheme targeting elderly homeowners." The judge leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Mr. Brennan, do you have proof the loan was disbursed?" Brennan fumbled with his papers, his confidence faltering. "The signed documents should be sufficient." "They're not," Catherine said coldly. Not when the signature is fraudulent. Judge Callahan removed his glasses slowly. I'm granting the emergency stay. This foreclosure is halted pending a full investigation. He looked directly at Brennan. And you can tell Mr. Voss I want him in this courtroom next week to answer some very specific questions. Dorothy covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face as the reality settled in. Her home was safe. For now. Outside the courthouse, Stone stood beside his bike while Catherine packed her briefcase. What do you charge for something like that? He asked. She smiled faintly. For taking down a fraud ring? Nothing. I'll bill Voss after we bury him. Stone nodded once, respect clear in his expression. Then he turned to Dorothy. You got people watching your house tonight. She shook her head, suddenly afraid again. Stone pulled out his phone. You do now? That night, Dorothy Keane's house on Willow Creek Road was quieter than it had been in months, but it wasn't empty. 3 motorcycles sat parked in her gravel driveway, their chrome reflecting the porch light, while the riders who belonged to them took shifts walking the perimeter and sitting on the front steps. Stone had made it clear to the club that Dorothy wasn't just another case. She was someone who had been targeted by a predator, and predators didn't stop until they were forced to. Inside, Dorothy sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, still trying to process the fact that strangers, men she had been taught her whole life to fear, had stepped in when everyone else had turned away. Stone leaned against the counter, arms folded. You get some rest, ma'am. Nobody's getting near this house tonight. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Why are you doing this? Stone was quiet for a moment. My grandmother lost her house to a scam like this when I was a kid. Nobody helped her. She died in a rented room 6 months later. He met Dorothy's gaze. I can't fix that, but I can make sure it doesn't happen to you. Over the next 2 weeks, Catherine Cross tore through Sunrise Holdings like a hurricane. With the club's help, she tracked down other victims, elderly homeowners, disabled veterans, widows living alone, all of whom had been targeted with the same fraudulent loan scheme. Signatures had been forged using publicly available documents. Loan money had never been dispersed. And Richard Voss had built an empire by betting that his victims were too old, too poor, or too scared to fight back. He had been wrong. The case made headlines. Federal investigators got involved. And when Voss finally stepped into Judge Callahan's courtroom 3 weeks later, he was flanked by lawyers who couldn't stop what was coming. The foreclosures were voided. The victims' homes were restored. And Voss faced charges that would keep him in courtroom battles for years. But the moment Stone remembered most didn't happen in court. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when Dorothy invited the club to her house for dinner. She had spent 2 days cooking, insisting it was the least she could do, and when the riders arrived, they found her small dining room table covered with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and homemade pie. They sat together, bikers and a widow, sharing a meal that felt less like gratitude and more like family. Before they left, Dorothy walked Stone to his bike and pressed a small envelope into his hand. Inside was a photograph of her and her late husband standing in front of the house, smiling, younger, whole. I want you to have this, she said softly. So you remember that what you saved wasn't just a building. It was a life. Stone stared at the photo for a long moment, then carefully tucked it into his vest pocket, right above his heart. As the motorcycles rolled down Willow Creek Road that evening, the sun setting behind them in shades of orange and gold, Stone thought about all the things people believed when they saw men like him. Dangerous, lawless, outsiders. And he thought about Dorothy Keane, who had seen past all of that and trusted him with the most important thing she had left. Sometimes, he realized, the world's biggest battles weren't fought with fists or fury. Sometimes they were fought by simply refusing to walk away when someone whispered, "Don't let them take my home." And sometimes, the roughest men carried the gentlest hearts.